Good evening and welcome to a very, very special event that we're hosting here within the School of Social Sciences. We have a special guest lecturer here with us who I will introduce here in a moment. And this is part of a book launch as well. We're launching Low Carbon and Loving It, and hearing from Mark Delaney, who has a very illustrious life that he will share about with us here tonight. Among some of the highlights he has sent to me by way of a short bio to introduce him. He has law and commerce degrees from the University of Queensland. He went on a short-term trip to India in 1989, a trip that transformed his life. He met Kathy in 1991, and they married in 1993, and left for India in 1995, and have been living there ever since. Among serving with servants to Asia's urban poor for over 20 years. Basically, their focus has primarily been living in poor Muslim neighborhoods, where they attempted to respond to various community issues, build relationships with neighbours, and work with local NGOs. And that's led to many adventures, he says. Among these adventures, they've had to build their own toilet on the bank of a drainage canal, assisted in a nasty slum demolition, and had tear gas float through their room. Now I think we have interesting stories to look forward to. Mark has two sons, Tom, 21, and Oscar, 16, both born in Delhi and spent most of their lives there. Kathy and Tom are back in India now, and Oscar and Mark will return at the end of March. It's a real privilege to have someone from so far away with a life as Mark's to launch this book with us tonight and share about his life of living in the slums in India. Mark likes to play all sorts of sports, the latest of which is learning to surf. He also loves speaking at events like this, although he's actually an introvert and will need several hours to recover from this afterwards. So shall we put our hands together as we welcome Mark? It's great to have you.
Well, thanks very much, Johannes, and it really is nice to be here. I do enjoy speaking with groups of people who have a similar heart and similar values, and I'm assuming that you're here tonight because you do. Normally in a group like this, I'd love to hear all of your names and get that in here, but time's pretty short, so forgive me if I don't learn all of your names. I will ask some of your names during the night, and I've already got to know some of you. So I've met John and Joyce, is that right? And Jeannie, so I've met a few of you already. I have been at CHC before, doing a couple of little guest lectures, and I've enjoyed those times, so thanks for welcoming me back. What we're going to do tonight is kind of in two halves. The first half, we're going to talk about our time, what led us to India and what we do in India. I believe the students who are in Johannes's class now are going to do a subject called community development later in the semester. Is that correct? Yep. So what we've been trying to do in India for many years is do community development. So I'm going to show you one model of what that's like. It doesn't mean it's the only model, and there's many models, but I want to show you some of what we've done in India. The second half of it, I want to talk a little bit about climate change and what that means for the world, and how troubled we have become as we've listened to our Indian friends about that issue, and that's led to my son, Tom, and I co-authoring this book that we just published, and we've just run a launch at a bookshop here in Brisbane a couple of weeks ago, and on Tuesday I'm going down to Sydney to do a few more book launch events. Then I'm going on to Melbourne, and because the book is about low carbon and loving it, I'm doing all of that by train, not by flight. So I'm really looking forward to that. Actually, I've saved up all these movies that I've been too busy to watch, and all these books that I want to read, and I'm going to use my 12 hours on the train doing that. So anyway, let's get into it. First of all, I've got some images here that I'll show you that hopefully explain some of the things that we're talking about. So very, very little bit about myself first. I grew up on the east coast of Australia in a place called Bachelor. Some of you will have heard of that. Byron Bay, it's a whole beach culture. I was into sailboarding when I was a young bloke, so there's me with my sailboard on the roof racks, and I was a typical Australian young guy. You know, I enjoyed all of the good things of youth in Australia, so the surf and parties and all of that stuff. So that was my youth. It was a very normal childhood, but I was very, very blessed really to have a very stable family, and I'm very thankful for that. I went to Queensland University because from Ballina the nearest universities are in Brisbane. You know, Sydney's 800 kilometres away and Brisbane's 200 away, so people from our part of the neck of the woods tend to go to Brisbane universities. I went to Queensland Uni and I studied law and commerce and graduated from there in about 1990, so there I am in my graduation gear. As Johanna said, in 1989, when I was still studying my degree, I went to India on a short-term mission trip. And this is me in my garb during that trip. It was a pretty hardcore short-term mission where we would live very simply, and we would live in a Muslim community because Muslims were regarded in those days as the hardest to reach kind of group. And am I wandering around too much for you? It's okay? Good. Thank you. So it was a profound experience for me. A lot of short-term missions I'm not that happy with because it's set up as, hey, go to this place and you can make a difference. You know, you can bring all this good stuff to those poor people. Well, largely that's just not true. You know, what you can do in 4 weeks or 8 weeks really is nothing. You can just be a burden on the people that are there doing the work. So I think we market these things poorly. But what they can do is give you an experience of the developing world that might make us more thankful for what we have in Australia. If so, that's great. And it might give you an understanding of what it would take to be a development worker or a missionary, depending on the language you want, in those contexts. It'll just give you some understanding of that. That's what this did for me. The one experience that changed my life, and I'm not sure why it was this particular one, but I remember going to an Indian chap and he lived in, you could only call it a shack really. It was made out of plastic and timber, and with my little bit of Hindi I had, I shook his hand and I said, you know, how are you doing? And he explained to me that his wife had just given birth to their second child in that plastic hut, which was their home, with no medical assistance whatsoever. And I shook his hand to say goodbye, and his hand just felt like a lump of ice. It was freezing because it was December in India, which is their winter, and he was obviously struggling to stay warm. A very simple interaction, but I came away from that profoundly affected, thinking, why is the world this way? That I can be born in Australia and I can have world-class education and healthcare and a stable life, and this chap, who through no fault of his own are in these circumstances and life is that tough, it profoundly affected me. And I thought, God cannot be happy about this situation. I'd come to faith a couple of years before at university, and I thought, God can't be happy with this situation. So I kind of said to God there and then, if I can help to redress some of these injustices in the world, then here I am. So very simple interaction, but sometimes that happens, doesn't it? These very simple things really have a big impact on your life. So then I was, again, incredibly fortunate or blessed, depending on what language you want to use, to find my wife, Kath. Kath had been through a similar kind of upbringing, and she also went on a short-term trip to India and was also profoundly affected by it. Kathy is a mathematician and a computer scientist, and she won the university medal at the University of Queensland for mathematics. That means she was the best mathematics student in the whole university. She's brilliant. But after finishing her honours in maths and computer science, she kind of said to God, that's enough of academia for now. I want to go and see the real world. So she worked with homeless kids in Woodridge for a couple of years. Kind of when you think about it, that kind of blows my mind that someone would do that, but she did, and that kind of speaks to what kind of woman she is. So I feel incredibly blessed to have found Kath, and I'm missing her a lot now because she's been back in India for 2 weeks and still another 4 weeks till I get to see her again. But anyway, it is what it is. So off we went to India, And we deliberately wanted to live in places, what many Australians would call a slum. We wanted to live with the poor, because one principle of community development that I'd like to share with you is the best way to understand someone's life, someone's problem, is to live with them. There is no better way than that. You know, you can read about it in textbooks, you can watch docos about it, but there is no better way to understand someone's issues than to live with them. So we wanted to move into a poor neighbourhood to try to understand a little bit of what life was like for people who lived in those areas. It's my ball, my comfort ball. This is a place called Junta Colony. We lived there for about 10 years. This place started with plastic kind of shacks like this, and slums in Asia start like that. You know, it's a little bit of land that the government finds useless and nothing else is happening there. So people build plastic shacks on it. You know, they've come in from the villages where they can't make ends meet on the farm anymore. This is happening to hundreds of thousands, millions of people all over the world every year. People can't make a go of it on the land, so they send their eldest son to the city to try to earn some money, because the income earning opportunities are much better in cities. So off he goes, he's got no money, so he just erects a bit of a plastic shack on some unwanted land. And then a whole bunch of other people do the same thing. And then if the police don't come and knock it down, and after a couple of years you've got enough money to brick up some of your walls, and after another couple of years you've got enough money to put a floor on it, and then another couple of years you've got some money to put on some more brick walls, after 30 years it looks like this. That's illegal, informal slum, but it's on a piece of land, I think, about the size of the Gabba cricket ground, if you can imagine that, if you've ever been to the Gabba. And it's home to 70,000 people. So when you think about it, that's, you do the numbers on it, that's, that population density is enormous. Because most people live in rooms like a single room. This is where we lived, in this room. It's about 3 metres by 3 metres, I suppose it's about, that's the size of the room there. Our family, that was our family's room. I think the next one, yeah, that's where we live at the moment. That's our house. It's our everything. It's where we sleep. We put the mattresses out at night time. During the day you pack the mattresses up, and it's your dining room, and it's the boys' study room, and it's the entertainment room, and it's everything. That's our house. And in fact, it's my understanding that the majority of the world's 7.5 billion people live in single room accommodation. Now that's hard for an Australian to get their head around, where we've got 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, a couple of garages, a couple of en-suites, whatever. The majority of the world's population, it's my understanding, live in a single room. So because that's how most people live, that's how we wanted to live, and that's how we've lived for a long time. That's the room where Kathy and Tom are right now. Tom's the bloke on the left there, he's 21. Kathy, my wife, in the green. Oscar is our 16-year-old, and then me. It gets pretty hot in North India, as you can see. So we try to live like local people. It means we don't have a car. So we get around on public transport like a rickshaw here. It means we don't have running water, so we bring our water from the ground floor up, and we put it in a bucket like this that we've drilled a little tap into, and that becomes our running water. We don't have a washing machine, we don't have a fridge. We share a toilet with I think 12 other people in the household. So we try to live like locals. And I guess that's another principle of community development that I want to talk about is if you want to go in and help, don't set yourself up as the expert or the big guy. Come in as one of them and look and listen and learn from people, because they are the experts in their situation. Does that kind of make sense? Yep. Okay, so there's 2 principles of community development I've talked about. What are they? Let's to see how your recall is. What was the first one I talked about? Live with people. Live with people. And the second one was? Live like them and learn from them. Yeah, we could do it in a series of L's. Live with people and learn from them. So one of the great community development teachers says his principle of community development is, and excuse the language, it's his language, not mine, but go into a context, sit down, shut up, and be a nice person. Go in, sit down, shut up and be a nice person. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. So that's what we try to do. So we live in places like that. We live fairly simply with people. Sometimes it's difficult. So this is the riot that happened, that we got the tear gas. I don't think that's tear, I think that's just smoke. But there was a riot happened, a couple hundred metres away from our house. It was over the government shutting down businesses because they were illegal. And that meant people were going to be unemployed. And so they sent the riot police in. And the riot police in India, as I suppose they do all over the world, they've got batons and they've got tear gas. And we found out that day that tear gas is pretty effective, actually. It does make you cry. So we had a bit of shrapnel of a tear gas cylinder land in our front, in our place, and the tear gas wafted through, and we're thinking, oh my goodness, I wonder if this is dangerous. So we just got on the phone to an Indian doctor friend of ours, and we said, we've got tear gas in our place right now, is that a problem? And he said, no, she'll be right. So we just got on with it. So sometimes it's difficult, but by and large, it's been an incredibly satisfying experience. I'll just stop there for a moment. Are there any questions you want to ask at this stage about anything at all? Open slather. Yeah.
How did you convince your wife to live like this?
Well, the interesting thing is, can I ask your name, please?
Alyssa.
Alyssa. The interesting thing is, Alyssa, is that my wife is more courageous than I am, considerably. So it was more, she had to convince me to go into places like this. I'm conservative and I'm fearful and I don't like change and all of that stuff. My wife is a very gutsy woman. So she had to convince me to go into places like this. But she's a very convincing woman, so I followed her. Yeah, it wasn't like I had to drag her kicking and screaming.
What about kids?
And similarly, our kids, when they were born in Delhi, so they were born in that context, they didn't know anything different. So they weren't saying, hey, Mum and Dad, let's go back to Australia, because they had never been to Australia. So it was more like that has become home for them. And so if any of you are thinking about overseas work, here's another little kind of guideline, is go before you have kids. Because life like that is a lot easier as a couple without kids. And then if your kids are born there, it's a piece of cake for them. So they'll pick up the language better than you will. And so our kids are both, Tom is fluent in Hindi and Urdu now. He reads and writes, 3 languages now, without trying very much, just because he's grown up there. So, any other questions?
Yeah, just like the schooling for
Yep.
the kids.
Yep.
Do they have to be homeschooled, or do
It's a good question.
slums have the opportunities to go to
Yep,
school?
it's a good question. And your name?
Roxanne.
Roxanne, one of the biggest criticisms people have made of us, of Kathy and I over the years is, well, it's okay for you guys to do these stupid things, go and live in slums and whatever, but you can't impose it on your kids. Don't restrict your kids' opportunities in life because of your stupid ideals. That's kind of what, they don't use those words, but that's what they mean. In fact, some of you are probably thinking that right now, and that's okay. But what we've found is that, what we did with education was, first couple of years they went to a local school. It was a totally Muslim school. It was around the time of 9/11, and we thought, Kathy and I said, I think now's not the time to tell our relatives and friends in Australia that our kids are going to a totally Muslim school. So we didn't. We just chose to omit that information. So that was a great experience because it was very good for their language, because all their classmates were speaking Hindi and Urdu, so their language got very good. When Tom was about 5, we came back to Australia for a break. He went to primary school over at Dutton Park, because we lived in the West End, Gabba kind of area. He went to Dutton Park Primary School, and he comes out of that experience going, wow, school is so much fun in Australia. They've got all these toys and this fantastic oval and all this sports equipment, and the teachers are great, and there's only 15 or 20 kids in the class. He's used to 50 kids in the class. Schooling in Australia is fantastic. And so, as we do with all of these decisions, as a family, we sit down and we have a discussion. We never, and this is another kind of principle, we never impose stuff on our kids that they don't want to do. Because if you do, you're just asking for trouble. It's going to come back to bite you later. So we always have a discussion as a family. And so we said, all right, boys, so schooling in Australia is great, schooling in India is boring, what are we going to do about it? So we had the idea, maybe we could homeschool then, because then it could be interesting, Mum and Dad can make it interesting. So we did that for a few years. And then we swapped over to distance education through the Brisbane School of Distance Education. So it's a Queensland government school. And so Tom finishes grade 12 that way, does really well, and then he can go to Queensland Uni. So education has worked well. Thanks for the question. So, this is the poorest place we lived in. This was a slum called Barapula. It's built on the bank of a drainage canal. Again, it's a piece of land that's useless to everybody else. So that's where slums develop. So this was a kind of a newer slum, if you like, which means they haven't had a chance to build it up as much as the other one. This was home to about 6,000 Muslims, so probably 1,000 families. And our house was just on the other side of those trees. Thankfully, our house was on the side of the drainage canal, so we built our own toilet around about this kind of area because the community toilet block was 500 metres away. Now that's fine when you're healthy and well and you've got time to get to the loo, but when you're not healthy and well and you've got the runs, it's a long run to get 500 metres. So we built our own toilet. So that Australian kind of sense of do it yourself, fix it yourself served us very well, really. We just got some wood and some plastic and whatever, and we just knocked it up ourselves. It wasn't plumbed into a sewerage system, mind you. It just kind of flowed out onto the bank of the canal like everybody else's. But this leads me to what did we do when we were in India? We tried to respond to issues that are present for the people at the time. And this is kind of another principle of community development. Don't go in with your agenda saying, I know what your problem is, buddy, and I'm going to fix your problem, right? Go in as a learner and look and listen and understand from their perspective what are their issues, okay? So I might look at that context and I might say, as an Australian, oh, the biggest issue there is sanitation. Look, it stinks, there's crap everywhere, there's pigs, it's awful. The biggest issue is sanitation. And a lot of Westerners do that. They'll go in and they'll just clean it all up. But we'd say, no. If for them the biggest issue is not sanitation, don't deal with sanitation. So you look and you listen and you learn and you find for people here, the biggest issue is stable employment. So you work on that. So we worked on that with people and we try to help them do up a bit of a CV and how to present in a job interview, and we try to get them to go for interviews for what we'd call a formal job. In most parts of the world, the economy is divided into two parts. One is what they call the informal economy, people that just go out to work on a daily basis and whatever they earn that day, that's what they've got. The formal economy is when you've got an actual job and you're paid on a weekly basis and there's some kind of sickness benefits and all that kind of stuff. Everybody in Australia works in the formal sector. In India that's not so. So we would try to get people jobs in the formal sector. Even if it was working in McDonald's, that was seen as, wow, that is a prestigious job if your kid's working in McDonald's because it's in the formal sector. Interesting, eh? Another issue that came up for these guys is that the government decided, we don't like this slum anymore, we're going to bulldoze it. So we had just moved out because Kathy was pregnant with Oscar at the time and was incredibly sick. But some friends came to our house and they said, come and have a look. And they showed me on the toilet block, there was a sign put up by the government and it said in Hindi, you will be rehabilitated in 6 days' time. Now that's government speak for, in 6 days' time, we will bulldoze your slum and we will put you on a piece of land 21 kilometres on the outskirts of the city. Now governments across the developing world are doing this because they don't like international guests seeing this, right? Delhi had the Commonwealth Games back in 2010 or something. They don't want international guests seeing this because this is a bad name for the country. So what do? They demolish it and shift people way to the outskirts where the innocent eyes of guests coming from Australia won't see it, right? It's happening all over the world. So our Muslim friends say to us, that's outrageous, we can't, it was the middle of winter, it was freezing cold, their kids were about to sit their exams, Eid was coming up. Who knows what Eid is? Yeah, what's Eid?
It's effectively like Christmas.
It's like Christmas for Muslims, that's right. It's like Christmas for Muslims. It's the biggest religious festival of the year. Eid was coming up. They said it's a terrible time. They said, fair enough, since this is illegal, we're willing to go, but we want a guarantee that we're going to get legal land on that other place, and we want it delayed for 3 months until our kids finish their exams, Eid's over, and the weather's not so bad. So being an ex-lawyer, I went to a group of local lawyers and I said, hey, would you guys be willing to act for these guys? And they said, sure. So I found myself in a liaison position between the Indian lawyers who were speaking English and my friends who were speaking Hindi, and I just kind of go between the two groups. And often as Westerners we can do that. Kind of got a foot in both camps. So that's what we did. We went back and forth to the Delhi High Court several times. In the end we had a win. We got an injunction, a short-term injunction, and then we got it pushed out for 3 months. Eid was done, and the kids' exams were done, and people took down their own houses brick by brick in order to... Well, why would they take down their own house brick by brick? Why would they do that? To reuse the bricks, exactly. When they get to the new place, they'd use the same bricks. Because even though a brick is only, I don't know, 20 cents or something, 20 cents is 20 cents. So that's what they do. So it was all very calm and peaceable, and there were no bulldozers involved, and there was no violence and no loss of life. So what I'm saying is, we respond to things as they happen, not with the agenda, Mark, the expert lawyer, is going to fix you up. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, 3 principles of community development so far. The first one was? Live with them. No better way to get to understand people than to live with them. Second one was? Learn from them. And the third one was?
No agenda.
Yeah, not my agenda, their agenda. Okay, how are we going? I'm doing pretty well. Here's another thing that we did is this young woman, Kenese is her name, she moved to this slum, and she had a husband and 3 kids. Soon after we met her, her husband died. We think probably of TB. Now TB is a massive killer. There's hundreds of people die every day of TB in the world. Her husband died, so she's left as a widow. Sometime after that, her youngest baby died as well, probably of diarrhoea. Again, diarrhoea, huge killer across the developing world. Simple thing that nobody should ever die of diarrhoea, but thousands of kids do. So this poor woman she's illiterate, she's disabled herself with 2 turned feet that were never fixed up, and she has 2 surviving kids, and she's a widow, and she's got no income. So we found out that the Delhi government had a widow's pension. Now, it was only 1,000 rupees a month, but it would, it's enough for something. So we said to Kenese, hey, how about you get a widow's pension? And she said, great, how do I do that? So we go off to the pensions office, and they say, well, where does she live? And we said, oh, well, she lives right here. And they came along to visit her, and they said, well, we're not going to give you a pension, you live in a shack. And that's her house that she's standing in front of, you live in a shack. But I knew the rules. So I said to the officials, well, it doesn't matter if you live in a palace or you live in a shack. Every Indian citizen is entitled to a widow's pension if they're a widow. And they kind of scuffed their feet and wrung their hands, and in the end they said, oh, all right. But she's got to have some identity documents. She's got to have a bank account. Kenese hasn't got a bank account. So we went off to the bank, and the bank manager said, oh, I suppose, yeah. So after a lot of hand-wringing again, we got a bank account. So she's got a bank account, and then we go back to the pension office, and they say, no, she needs documentary proof that she's been resident in that shack for 5 years. Now this is just par for the course for India and many developing world countries where officials are all high and mighty, and they state all these rules to lock people out of the system. What they're really looking for is a bribe, and a bribe of a couple of 1,000 rupees would have got her the pension, but Kenese didn't have a couple of 1,000 rupees. We could have given her the bribe, but if that happens, then it just makes it worse for the next widow that's trying to get them. So we didn't want to do that. In the end, we wrote an official letter of complaint, and after 6 months of battling with the bureaucracy, Kenese got a widow's pension. So really most of my time in India, I've become a bit of an expert at entitlements for the poor and what they're entitled to. And I've helped people to fight for their entitlements. And so I run workshops for World Vision and various people like that in how to help the poor get what is due to them. And that's become my thing, which is kind of a nice little mesh with my legal background. So that's kind of what I've done. And I think, just the other thing to say is we've made sure that we've worked for Indian organisations, not set up our own thing. So that's kind of another principle of community development. Don't go in and set up your own organisation. There will be existing organisations and networks already there, whether they be prison fellowship or whatever. Use what's there and work with them and improve what they do, rather than set up your own thing. I think often people set up their own thing as a bit of an ego thing, really, to see your name there. But that's not what it's about. It's about, really, if you're a believer, that it's about the kingdom of God advancing, not about the kingdom of Mark advancing. So we've worked with Indian organisations. This guy here, the guy that we're swinging, it's just a game. He's not disabled. We're just... his name was Anthony, South Indian gentleman who came to the slums of North India and worked there. He's the loveliest guy that I've ever met. Just a delightful man, a wonderful worker among the poor, far better than I ever could be. And so they are the people that we would seek out. Local people who are doing the work far better than we would do it, and get beside them and encourage them to keep going in their work. Unfortunately, my dear friend Anthony died of, I think it was pancreatic cancer a couple of years ago, and that was very distressing. I went back for the funeral and it was a very sad time. But Anthony was a lovely guy. Interestingly, this book that we've just written, we've dedicated to the memory of Anthony. Last thing, I'd run workshops. This is a workshop I ran for legal rights for people who had disabilities. You'll see people in wheelchairs there, because there's a disabled pension as well. That will do on our stuff in India. Any more questions about community development or what we did in India, why we did it, anything at all?
How were you employed?
How was I, in other words, how did I get my money? Yep. That's the question? That's a really good question, John. Interestingly, it's the second most frequently asked question after, what do you do about your kids' education? Which Roxanne asked. So these are very good questions. We have done a couple of things. One is we've used our own savings from work that we'd done prior to going to India. Sometimes when we come back to Australia for an extended period, we'll get a part-time job. Kathy worked as a kind of a before-school carer at Morningside State School for a while. So we do bits and pieces of work. I work as kind of a consultant for development organisations. So partly I own savings, and partly I was given some inheritance a few years back when my mum passed away, and we're using some of that. But we can live in India like that for about 10 or 12,000 Australian bucks a year. Right, the expenses are pretty minimal when you live like that. And I know people hear me say, well, you're living off other people's income, which is also, sometimes people would give us money. Missionaries would call that support. So we were supported for a number of years. And I know some people are critical of that, saying, well, it's other people's hard-earned money and you're just kind of scabbing off them, that kind of stuff. But we figure, look, we've all got to make choices in life about how we use our time. We have chosen to use our time there doing that. And we feel pretty good about that. The consequence is, I'm 51 years old and I've got 5,000 bucks in my superannuation account, right? The consequence is we don't have our house. The consequence is we don't have anywhere that is our place in Australia. Now, we'll deal with that. That's the consequences that come to us from those decisions. But that's life, eh? We've all got to make our decisions. And so far, we're pretty happy with the decisions we've made. If people want to criticise us for those decisions as economically irresponsible, that's cool, that's your prerogative, you can do that. Any other questions?
What were some of the biggest cultural adjustments that you made when you moved over there?
Yeah.
And then reverse culture shock?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question, Jeannie, right? It's a good question. One of the biggest cultural adjustments moving there is every culture has a hierarchy of values, right? What's most important in that culture and what's not so important. In Australia, there's kind of a culture of, a reasonable culture of telling the truth and being honest. I think that's being eroded, but it has been a strong value in Australia, of looking after the little guy, being nice to the little people. Of egalitarianism, those are some of the big cultural values in Australia which are wonderful and godly things. Whereas in Australia, hospitality is kind of down there a little bit. So a stranger walks up to your door, well, you don't greet him and offer him a cup of water, you say, well, who are you and what do you want? In India, it's kind of the opposite. Hospitality is top of the pile. Anybody walks up to your door and you will give them a drink of water and offer them a cup of tea and be nice to them. Truth, unfortunately, is down. Truth is not a big value in India. So you'll just say whatever you need to say to get the result you want. It doesn't matter whether it's true or a lie. So I found that difficult going to India, where truth was not highly valued. Nor was cleanliness highly valued. That was difficult for me. Nor was punctuality highly valued, and that was difficult for me, right? But when I come back to Australia, what's difficult here is, I'm not talking about you're obviously all different, but by and large, Australians don't give a stuff about what's going on over there. Don't care. I come back here chock full of stories of tear gas and poverty and slums, and I used to expect my Australian colleagues to be sympathetic to that, but instead I find out they're more worried about how their footy team's doing, you know, or their house repayments or whatever. Now, over the years, I've learnt to be less judgmental about that. I figure, look, if the biggest thing in your life, mate, is that your footy team's losing, so be it. I'll listen to you about your footy team. And I've just got to keep that inside. So what I'm saying is reverse culture shock is a very real thing. Coming back to Australia has been very difficult for us over the years. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just on workshops.
Yep.
Yeah, I know you're giving legal rights to people handicapped and that sort of thing.
Yep.
But if somebody was going over there with a talent or whatever,
Yes.
that might be,
Yes.
what kind of workshops would be most favourable?
Yes.
And second part to that, I know of, for instance, some missionaries working in Africa
Yeah.
that are building areas because they can get money supporting young children. So look, this poor child and their big eyes and they're hungry and all that kind of thing. But when they become teenagers, there's nothing for them.
Yes.
So they're working workshops as well as people into trades and
Yep.
some education, and finance is a big thing.
Yep.
Educating them in areas of finance.
Yep.
And leading to success, you know, as they go through.
Yep.
Is that the kind of thing that's needed in places like
I think it. What's your name? Sorry.
Roger?
Roger. I think it is Roger. I would just emphasise, though, it's very important to look and listen and learn for a period of time before we start anything, and to learn from the local people about what's really needed in this situation, rather than to formulate our ideas in Australia and then go and perform them. Does that kind of make sense? Go for a while and learn from local people. And if they say the biggest thing that we need is for our young people to learn how to fix mobile phones, then so be it, you know? But don't go with our preconceived ideas of what's necessary. But yes, of course, if we've got a skill and they're asking for that skill, of course we can be useful. I'd say the longer you can go for, the better, because the more you'll understand the situation. Is that enough on that, Roger? Yep, okay. Now, you had a question and then you had a question.
Just, what did the Indian government think about you living in a slum, in a land
Sure.
that,
we would be careful to go and register with the local police station wherever we lived. And they would try to convince us not to live there. They'd say, well, you're crazy. That place is full of thieves and bandits and murderers and whatever. And that's what people think about those places, but it's not true. So we'd say, respectfully, you know, in Hindi, sir, one of your great heroes, Mahatma Gandhi, deliberately went and lived with the poor to understand what their lives were like. We are trying to do similarly. You know, we're of course following Jesus' footsteps, who also, by the way, came from a very nice situation, that is heaven, and came to a very not nice situation, that is Galilee, didn't he? That was his way of working. So we didn't tell the police that, but we said your great hero Mahatma Gandhi did this kind of thing, and Mother Teresa did a similar kind of thing. So he goes, oh yeah, I suppose they did, yeah, and they'd let us do it. But we would be very careful to tell the officials what we were doing, so that there was no hint of suspicion or whatever.
How did you get clean drinking water in situations?
That's also a great question. That's probably the third most frequently asked question. We figure...
Because you're still alive.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What we found was, if it doesn't matter how filthy it is outside your door, if you keep your little space clean, and we would sweep it every day, you filter your own drinking water. So we always filter our own drinking water with a simple ceramic filter, which you can just buy locally, and you cook your own food. that is, you don't buy food from the market that's lukewarm, and you get your immunisations, then you're in pretty good state. It doesn't matter how filthy or how stinky it is out there. If you filter your water, cook your food, keep your own house clean, you're not bad. Yeah.
As well as like adapting to the local customs and so on, were there specifically Muslim customs to do with gender roles and so on that you had to adapt to? Definitely. So the secret of going into any culture is you adopt the forms of that culture that are not counter to the gospel, and so as not to cause offence. You know, so Paul talks about that. You know, don't prove to be a stumbling block. So what that means is my wife Kathy, whenever she goes out, she will cover her head, because that's respectful in Muslim culture. Okay, it means I don't talk to to women, because that's not respectful in Muslim culture either. So issues of modesty and so forth, only dealing with someone with your right hand, not eating pork is a good one. So I used to love roast pork as a kid, it was great. But when we moved to a Muslim context, we just said, oh well, that's it for pork, no more pork, because then we could honestly answer our friends' questions, do you eat pork? Because they figure every single white person in the world eats pork, and we say, actually no, we don't eat pork, we gave that up years ago. Oh, Bohatacha. Very good. Very good. So, yeah.
Well, that kind of touched on a few, but some of us will be aware of the pastor from Kenmore in India that was murdered a few years ago by a group of Muslims and that.
Yes.
So how do you kind of generate, do you get to preach the gospel? Do you, you know, how do you handle that?
It's a good question again, Roger. I would say, I think it was John and I were talking earlier about this, that my understanding is the best, yes, we do preach the gospel is the short answer, but my understanding of the best way to preach the gospel is for people to see the gospel lived out in my own life. So Francis of Assisi, I think, famously said something like, preach the gospel to all the world and use words if you have to. And I think that's pretty spot on. You know, the world is full of words, and words are meaningless to many people because, you know, untruth is so common. But if you live out a compassionate life, then I think people see the gospel. And when they're interested, when they ask, then yes, actually the reason I do this is this. And I can talk about my guru, and his name's Jesus. So yes, we do it, but we do it very sensitively. And so over the years, we have seen some people come to faith, but far better evangelists than us are Indian people like my friend Anthony, because they don't have all those cultural barriers to get over. You know, so I think our job is to empower the local people to do their work better, rather than me be the great evangelist. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. We'd better move on because we're running out of time. Is that what you were about to say?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, how did you come from all of this to have interest in
climate change? Yeah, it's a good... Okay, two reasons. Two reasons. One is, we would get our international news for probably 10 years in Delhi. The only source of international news we'd get was a friend would send us a weekly copy of a newspaper called The Guardian Weekly. Has anyone ever heard of The Guardian Weekly? Wonderful source of international news. So as we read The Guardian Weekly every week for a couple of years, we see, hey, climate change is it's getting worse and worse. And all of these signs happening, and there's great slabs of ice breaking off in the Antarctic, and temperatures are going up, CO2 levels in the atmosphere are growing, the sea levels. We think, wow, this is really, really serious. And then we go to some of our Indian friends and people who are farmers. This guy, a guy we met, and we said, hey, do you experience the climate changing at all? And he said, yeah. He said, 10 years ago, we would know exactly what day to plant our rice. We knew that if you plant the rice on the 7th of July or whatever it was, the monsoon rains would be there within a week, and it'd flood the rice paddy and we're away. But he said, now, we don't know when the monsoon's coming. It might come early, it might come late, or it might not come at all. So he said the weather has definitely changed. So we're going, wow, if this guy's been planting rice for generations and now it's different, that is really serious.
So then at one point in 2014, we come back to Australia for a break and we go, this is incredibly serious. And we thought, we'll find Australians feverishly working to reduce their carbon footprint, to be pumping less carbon into the atmosphere, which is causing the problem. Did we find that? No. We found people worried about how their footy team's doing. And what four-wheel drive are they going to upgrade to next? And what next international holiday are they going to go on? And how to upgrade their house to put another pool or a deck or something. Everything was bigger and grander and everything, and there was hardly a mention of climate change. And we thought, how has this happened? This is the most serious issue of our generation. If we don't get this right, we're in a whole lot of trouble. And yet we found Australians doing virtually nothing about it. So we were shocked. And so then I went and I ran some education things in schools, talking to school kids. I went and talked to politicians. I met, you'll be familiar with our current Labor government in Queensland, and the Deputy Premier is a woman by the name of Jackie Trad. Jackie Trad happens to be the member in South Brisbane, where I live. So I went and spoke to Jackie and I said, hey, this is incredibly serious. Why in the world are we digging up more coal? This is absurd. We all know the science. And she said, yeah, Mark, I know the science, but if we stop that coal mine, we'll lose the next election. And that is the bottom line. All that matters really is the next election. So we were just pulling our hair out, thinking, this is crazy. So in response to all of that, my 21-year-old son and I wrote this book called Low Carbon and Loving It. What we've tried to do in the book is, it's not a big judgment on Australians. It's just saying, what we do is we weave our own family story from the slums of India into this book to give it an interesting narrative twist. You know, so it's not just straight science, it's this family's journey through all this stuff. And we show some of these pictures and all of that. And then we compare a typical Australian, who we call Bruce, who is entirely fictitious, but if you're a Monty Python fan, you've got to call a typical Australian Bruce. We compare Bruce's lifestyle with our real Indian friend Ruxana, with her lifestyle. And Tom's great with the science and he's great with maths and numbers. We break those lifestyles down into several areas: housing, local transport, distance transport, diet, and so forth. And we compare the two. We find out that the typical Australian, the average Australian, emits 23 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The average Indian emits 2.3 tonnes, exactly a tenth. Now, if the United Nations says to us that we've got a carbon budget, meaning we can pump a certain amount of carbon into the atmosphere before we go over that threshold, and before we're into the realm of 2 degrees warming, and then 3 degrees warming, and then 4 degrees warming, depending on how much carbon we pump in there. They say our carbon budget to keep under 2 degrees warming, which is what the whole world has agreed at the Paris conference, the budget for that is now about 800 gigatons for the rest of the century. If you divide 800 gigatons by the world's population, you come up with something like 3 tonnes of carbon dioxide per person per year is the fair share that everybody's got. 3. Now, what was the Indians' carbon footprint? 2.3, they're under it. What's the Australians' carbon footprint? 23. It means if the whole world emits at the rate that Australians do, we're shot. We've blown our budget in 7 years and we're gone. So this is serious stuff. Now, I know there's debate in the church, I know there's debate in politics, but if you read the science, 97% of climate scientists say there is no debate on the science anymore. It is absolutely definite this is happening. The people who argue it are fossil fuel companies and politicians and corporations. The scientists are not arguing this anymore. It's a done deal. What matters is what we're going to do about it. That's why we've written the book. And that's what we're trying to promote. We hope that weaving our family story into this makes it an interesting read and it makes some difference. I was very happy yesterday to get a call from ABC Radio in Hobart, for whatever reason they found out about me. And I went into the studios in South Bank and did a live interview with Hobart. And I got a call today from a show called Nightlife. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that, but it's also a national ABC radio program. That'll happen next week. So I'm really glad that it's getting a little bit of traction, and I love talking about it and about you know, mostly the ABC and media are interested in living in a slum more than climate change, but hopefully you can slip in a bit of climate change at the end there. Yeah. Any other questions? I know we're about out of time, and I like being punctual. Any other questions about any of that? Even about climate change, if you want to say, Mark, that's a load of rubbish, that's fine. I'm absolutely happy to hear your opinion, that's fine.
Yeah, just a question. Do the people in India that we engage with, do they have climate change on their radar?
It's a very good question. Our friends, Johannes, in Hindi, there is no word for climate change. There isn't. In other words, my friends in the slum don't know about it. They are being affected by it, and the temperature is now 1 degree more than it was however many decades ago. So it's now 45 degrees on average rather than 44. So they know about it. They're dealing with that with no air conditioning. And my friends who grow rice know that the monsoon doesn't come on time, so they're affected by it, but they don't know it. They don't know what the stuff is. They haven't even got a word for climate change. So the short answer to the question is no. Why don't they know? Because the media that they listen to is interested in showing cricket matches and Bollywood movies. They're not interested in telling people about climate change. Similar to the Australian movies, you know, pumping, you know, movies and football and better car and whatever. There's a vested interest in not telling us too much about this. Otherwise, we might start paring back our consumption, and that's bad for business, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What would the ideal utopian future look like in your world?
Yeah. So there's two answers to this question depending on whether you're talking to a group of Christians or you're talking to a secular group.
To you, what is your idea?
What's my idea? What am I working towards? Okay. I'm working towards, in terms of climate change, a society where we produce all of our electricity renewably. No coal, no oil, no gas. All of our electricity renewably, and that is doable. The science is there, we can do it. With things like this. I'm sorry, I've just rushed through. This is called a concentrated solar thermal plant. They're building one in Port Augusta in South Australia now. Australia has such a vast landscape, such good sunlight, we can easily produce all of our electricity renewably with no coal and no gas and no oil. So our future would look like that. It would also mean that a lot of our public transport, our transport is run with electricity rather than fossil fuels, because you understand fossil fuels put carbon in the atmosphere, right? This is a high-speed rail network. If we had a high-speed rail network between Sydney and Melbourne, you do the trip in 3 hours. You factor in going to the airport, check in, all of that stuff. You're looking at about 3 hours to fly it anyway. We can do it in 3 hours with a high-speed rail network. What we need is the motivation and the demand from ordinary people to do it. That's why I'm not flying to Melbourne. That's why I'm going by train. If enough people do that, the government all of a sudden says, oh, wow, maybe it's worth doing this. So the argument that Tom and I make in this book is we can't leave it to the politicians, we can't leave it to the business leaders, because they follow consumers like you and I. We have to change. If we change, they will change. If we don't take flights, they will build high-speed rail networks. If we demand our electricity is generated renewably, they'll do that. If we stop eating as much meat, less meat will be produced. It's up to us. That's what we argue in this book. We can't put the responsibility on someone else. Any other questions?
The comparison of the Australians' carbon footprint with the woman in India's carbon footprint, is that just isolating that person as like an individual consumer, or is it factoring in the national industry and divvying that
It
up?
does, yeah. It also factors in that, because if you add up Bruce's carbon footprint, right, you get to about 17.5 tonnes of his own stuff that we can identify for him, his diet, his house, his travel. The last 5.5 tonnes is his share of all the infrastructure out there, the libraries, the roads, the airports, the military, etc., which all takes carbon, which we are all responsible, you know, we've all got to take a share of that. So it does factor in that. And so the Australian government produces these figures every year.
Because the emissions in India are massive, but is it just that the population's so huge that pro rata it's a tiny?
Correct, yeah. When you divide that over 1.2 billion people, that's why it's so tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the net emissions still, the
Oh, it's
difference
huge.
in scale.
Oh, it's huge.
immense.
And look, we will be made or broken.
Just putting it in
No,
the
no.
Aussies.
Sure, sure.
There's fewer of us.
There's fewer of us, absolutely.
Relatively.
And we will be made or broken on this thing probably on the back of India. Because if India pursues Western lifestyles, we're gone. That's the end of the story. We're gone. If they all want cars and air conditioning and 3-bedroom houses and international holidays, we're gone. The only hope for us then is that God will somehow miraculously save us. So it will make and break on India, for sure. Yeah.
It's always amazed me that, you know, all those years ago we went to the moon
Yep.
on hydrogen.
Yeah.
And here we are still putting petrol.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
And, I noticed also that in many, just recently, in many cities of Europe, they're now banning diesel.
Yes, yes.
Use of diesel in trucks
Yep.
and
That's right.
and cars. And so that
You're right.
is apparently coming across.
You're right. And, you know, scientists are brilliant, brilliant people and they come up with amazing solutions. The trouble is not the lack of science. The trouble is the lack of the political will and the will from people like you and I.
I think most of Australians are sort of apathetic and given up.
Yep.
Because, you know, take petrol for instance.
Yep.
All companies will a large stick financially to governments or that kind of thing.
They
as
do.
well.
Yeah.
Coal mining, as you said
Yep.
before.
Yep.
And we all know it, and we all ask for a change, but
Yep.
it never comes.
Yeah, you're right.
And it's kind of like, not we're outvoted, but we're outdolled.
Yeah. No, you're right, Roger. And a big battle in this is to, you know, I'm a pessimist as well. Whereas thankfully my son Tom is an optimist. So I look at the situation, I think, actually we're probably stuffed already. It's probably too far gone. But Tom would say, no, Dad, if ordinary people change, it can change. And I just choose to keep believing that it can. The signs aren't great, but I think, well, what's the alternative? That I just throw the towel in and say, okay, well, that's it. Oscar's kids are never going to see the Great Barrier Reef. Is that what I do? You know, I don't want to throw the towel in. I don't want to do what I can now. Because, I'll show you this, will probably be the last slide, but where is that one? That sign kind of says it all for me. I don't want my kids to say, why didn't you do something? And that's the danger that we all face, that our kids will come to us in 20 years' time and say, what in the world were you doing? Why did you not do something? I don't want that. I want to be able to say to my kids and my grandkids, look, I didn't do much, but I gave it my best shot. Interestingly, this is at a political protest. Now, I'm not sure what views you have about political protests, but I believe that peaceful political protest is okay. As long as it's peaceful and it's respectful and it's kind, it has its place. Because politicians need to understand what the situation is. This was a protest against a chap called Peter Dutton, who you'll be aware of. Peter Dutton was caught on an ABC microphone a couple of years back, joking with the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott that, oh, those Pacific Islands, they'll have water lapping at their door soon. And it was a joke. He was joking about the viability of Pacific Island nations. Now, for me, that just crossed a line. That's just unacceptable. So I did a protest with a bunch of other grandfathers to say that, look, that's just unacceptable from a political leader to joke about the viability of a whole country. Anyway, I'm not asking you to go out in a political protest. I'm just saying that was the decision that I came to for my own conscience. I'd love to talk more. I don't have to rush off, but it is 7 o'clock and 6 o'clock. So if you need to go, by all means go. I'm going to stick around. If you want to ask more questions of me, if you want to criticise me, if you want to say anything that I've said is a load of rubbish, that's fine. I'm happy to hear that. And if anyone... No, I'll just leave it there, I think. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. So if you want to stick around and ask questions, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
And maybe just as we wrap up the formal part of the event, this is a book launch as well, and so it is a perfect opportunity to pick up one of the books. Mark's come prepared with a few books that he will be able to sell
Yeah.
and sign and
Yep.
autograph for us all to have our own copy about their lives and
Yeah,
how they
yeah.
came to feel so strongly about climate change.
Yep.
And I think what we'll do is we'll set up a table over
Sure.
there somewhere. And
Sure.
what's the book sell?
Oh, so it's $20. It's $19.95, but I haven't got any 5-cent pieces, so you'll just have to deal with 20. And look, this isn't a big hard sell on the book. If you don't want to buy a book, I've really enjoyed myself anyway. But if you did want to do that, I'm happy to do it.
And it does have an endorsement from me.
That's right. One of the footnotes in the book says, we have received no financial inducement from any party. So look, I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed your questions. They were really good questions. I wish you well in your community development if you're doing that. And if you're not, I wish you well anyway. And I appreciate that you've come along tonight. It's been fun. Thank you.
And maybe just before we clap for Mark, if someone wanted to contact you, do you want to just say out loud your email address?
Sure. It's actually, well, the email, it's a very easy email address because we've created a new one for the book. So the email address is low.carbon.and.loving.it. So low carbon and loving it with dots in the middle @gmail.com. And that will get to us. We created that specifically for the book because we thought we may cop flack for this book because there's some people that don't like this kind of message. And we don't want all those yucky messages coming through our ordinary inbox. So we thought once a week we'll check that box and see if there's any yucky stuff there. But we'll also read it, and if you send me a nice mail, I'll certainly read that. So lowcarbonandlovingit @gmail.com. There's a blog for the book as well, which you might guess, www.lowcarbonandlovingit.wordpress.com. There's some of these, even if you don't want a book, there's a couple of these flyers here which talk a little bit about the book, and I think they've got the blog and the email address on there as well, and they're free. All right.
Yeah, wonderful. Look, let's really appreciate Mark one more time.
Thanks, Johannes.
Phenomenal. So yeah, we'll take a break here. The students who are part of the lecture for probably 15